guys that I met Paul and said, do you want to join my band, you know? And then George joined, and then Ringo joined. We were just a band who made it very, very big, that's all.
The 1950s were a great time of peace and prosperity after the conclusion of the Second World War. America was a prime example of what other nations all over the globe strived for in terms of wealth, happiness, and success. Men returned from battle only to settle in at home, make an honest living, and of course start families. America also had new avenues of entertainment emerging and connecting with America's youth. A driving force of the American dream was music. Heard in the theaters, listened to on the radio, and now seen as driving forces of cinema and a new market called television, composers of the time brought music to the masses. However, the young people started listening to something truly different. A sound that was fast, loud, and made them want to dance and sing at the top of their lungs. The older generations didn't know how to define it, as it was something new to their ears. It was a mixture of so many different kinds of sounds that people listened to since the turn of the century. Jazz, southern blues, and even country and gospel. It was soon to be given a name in 1954, rock and roll. 1955 saw a true breakout of this genre thanks to a single called Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley and his band the Comets. Other artists followed like Chuck Berry, Johnny Cash, and Carl Perkins, and they would top song charts and soon be heard everywhere. This new sound made such an impact that it would revolutionize how people would listen to the radio and purchase their music. One voice would truly shake up the world of music was his performances and of course his image. He, of course, was the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley. Second half of the 1950s saw rock and roll music seep into every corner like wildfire, and even make its way overseas. When rock and roll made it to England, it would catch the ear of one very special young man. Once he was hooked, there was nothing that would stop him from bringing his sound to the world. Well, that'll be the day when you say John Lennon was born into a troubled life in a poor industrial city in England called Liverpool. Having many hardships as a child, he would end up living with his aunt and soon be introduced to the sounds of early rock and roll. He would be given a guitar by his estranged mother, and she would even teach him how to play the banjo. Seeing the love for music that his mother had, he would soon have big dreams of becoming a famous musician. Being more of a realist, his Aunt Mimi tried to make him focus on school, but his passion and dreams would continue to veer him off the path. John would see the untimely death of his mother only at age 17 due to a car accident. That moment in his life would set the stage for him to begin his quest to becoming a famous musician, and from that point on, he would never look back. In 1956, John would put together a group with a couple of his school friends called the Blackjacks. The band consisted of John, Eric Griffiths on guitar, Pete Shoten and Bill Smith on washboard, and T. Chess bass. Music they played was a mix of rock and roll and skiffle, a popular type of music with blues, jazz, and folk influences, which was very popular in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. They would quickly change their name to the Quarrymen after a line from their high school song of Quarrybank High School. They would find opportunities to perform wherever they could: parties, school dances, cinemas, and amateur skiffle contests. In the summer of 1957, John would meet his kindred spirit, a young man named Paul McCartney. Soon afterwards, the members of the band invited McCartney to join as a rhythm guitarist. He formed a close working relationship with John. Shortly after, Paul would then join and introduce John to his schoolmate, George Harrison. Lennon thought that George Harrison, then at the age of 14, was too young to join the band. So McCartney engineered another meeting on the upper deck of a Liverpool bus where Harrison played Raunchy for Lennon, and he would become the Quarrymen's lead guitarist. Harrison's entry to the Quarrymen shifted the group a little bit further from skiffle. This would immediately stir up tensions in the Quarrymen, which would eventually see the departure of almost the entire band. The only ones that would remain would be John, Paul, and George, and it would be up to them to decide the band's fate. The first thing that the trio did was make an amateur recording of themselves in 1958, performing Buddy Holly's That'll Be the Day, then disband the name and start performing under other names, including Johnny and the Moondogs, Dogs and Japage 3. While their name was still up in the air, they would find a stable place for a regular performance thanks to a young woman named Mona Best. In 1959, Mona would open up a club in her cellar and would become a hot spot for teenagers to listen to their rock and roll music called the Casbah Coffee Shop. They would play there regularly until January 1960, when their bandmate Ken Brown would leave due to illnesses. At that time, there were 2 new recruits being sought after for the final 2 instruments that they lacked, which were a bassist and a drummer. John would look to his good friend Stuart Sutcliffe, who he had met before he dropped out of college. Stuart wasn't that passionate about music as John was, but he had big dreams of becoming an artist, and he did possess some musical talent. John was persistent. After talking to Sutcliffe, he and Paul persuaded Stuart to buy a bass guitar, and he would soon join the band in May 1960. Mona Best would offer their band her son Pete to be their drummer. The band, now totaling 5 members, would then officially begin their next monumental steps on their journey. They would acquire Neil Aspinall, a schoolmate of Paul and George, who had become very close with Pete and would become their band road manager. The last piece of the puzzle came from John's girlfriend Cynthia Powell, suggesting a band name similar to the current sensation from America, Buddy Holly and his band, the Crickets. She would come up with the Beatles, and that name would stick with the band for the rest of their music career. The Beatles wasted no time taking their show on the road, and Alan Williams would immediately book them for sets and residency in Hamburg, Germany. The area they played in was not one of the best environments, as they worked long hours for very little money, and they were hit at all sides with temptation and debauchery. It was not the easiest times for them. Paul and Pete were arrested and deported for arson, and George was also deported for lying about his age and performing in locations where anyone under the age of 18 was not permitted. Stuart, on the other hand, had found love with a German woman named Astrid Kirchner, who took some of the first amateur photos of the Beatles as a group. At times, the tensions were high as Stuart and John saw their friendship tested. Stuart would embrace Astrid's changes with his image by cutting Sutcliffe's hair in the style that was later adopted by the other Beatles, and of course John would not have it at the time. It was then that Stuart decided that he would leave the band and resume his path towards becoming a serious artist. Paul would take on the bass after Stuart's departure. Pete would also cause the band many hardships. He would come late to performances or sometimes not show up entirely. It would be the band's burden to find someone to take his place during his mess-ups. The Beatles would soon find saving grace in a young drummer named Richard Starkey, who went by the nickname of Ringo. In 1961, the Beatles would complete their time in Hamburg and return to Liverpool, where young fans were waiting for them. They would find a new home in a popular place called the Cavern Club. During one of their performances, a young record store owner and music columnist named Brian Epstein offered to become their new manager. Throughout early and mid-1962, Epstein sought to free the Beatles from their contractual obligations in Germany. Tragedy greeted the Beatles on their return to Germany in April, when a distraught Kirchner met with them at the airport with the news of Stuart's death. It would be found out that the cause of his death was a brain hemorrhage. Losing his friend didn't stop John, knowing how much Stuart had helped him and his band get off the ground. He then felt stronger about pressing on and adopting the look that Stuart sported thanks to Astrid for the rest of the band in his memory. It seemed that at this point, after all the hurdles, the Beatles were officially stable and ready to break out of the club scene and follow in the ways of their early rock and roll influences. Epstein wasted no time getting the Beatles out into the public. He began negotiations with record labels for a recording contract. After many rejections, Epstein would finally meet EMI Parlophone and be introduced to producer George Martin, who signed the Beatles to that label. Martin's first recording session with the Beatles took place at EMI's Abbey Road Studios in London on the 6th of June, 1962. Martin immediately complained to Epstein about Pete's poor drumming and suggested that they use a different drummer in his place for those sessions. Already dissatisfied with Pete's actions in Hamburg, the rest of the band had no issues with Epstein's request to fire him from the band, and they would quickly replace him with Ringo Starr. The Beatles would then go on to record their very first single, Love Me Do. They would also record 2 other songs, Please Please Me and P.S. I Love You. Released early in October of 1962, Love Me Do peaked at number 17 on the record charts. The Beatles would even see their television debut later that month with a live performance on the show People and Places. After a little extra work, Please Please Me would become the band's second single, and George Martin would return with some incredible news. The Beatles would have recorded their very first #1 single. By 1963, all 4 members of the Beatles would become equally valuable, regardless of imperfections. They had agreed that all 4 band members would contribute vocals to their albums, including Ringo, despite his restricted vocal range. John and Paul had established a strong songwriting partnership, and as the band's success grew, their dominant collaborations limited George's opportunities as lead vocalists. The Beatles recorded 10 songs during a single studio session for their debut album, Please Please Me. Released in March of 1963, the band's 3rd single, From Me to You, came out in April and was also a chart-topping hit, starring an almost unbroken string of 17 British #1 singles from the Beatles in the years to follow, including all but one of 18 that they would release over the next 6 years. Issued in August, the band's 4th single, She Loves You, achieved the fastest sales of any record in the UK up to that time, selling 750,000 copies in just under 4 weeks. It became their first single to sell 1 million copies and remained the biggest-selling record in the UK until 1978. Their commercial success brought increased media exposure, to which the Beatles responded with an irreverent and comical attitude that defied the expectations of pop musicians at the time, inspiring even more interest towards the band. As their popularity spread, a name for their crazed fans, which included greetings of riotous and enthusiastic screaming, was dubbed the phenomenon Beatlemania. Please Please Me maintained the top position of the charts for 30 weeks, only to be displaced by their second album, With the Beatles, which EMI released at the end of 1963. In a reversal of practice, EMI released the album ahead of an impending single, I Want to Hold Your Hand. The song itself was not included in the album, only to increase sales for the single. With the Beatles became the second album in UK chart history to sell 1 million copies, a figure previously held only by 1958's South Pacific soundtrack. At this point in time, the Beatles only believed that it was time to go even further with the success that they've had.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
While the UK was basking in Beatlemania, their music was starting to be heard about in America. The end of the 1950s marked a time of sorrow in rock and roll after the tragic deaths of Buddy Holly, the Big Bopper, and Ritchie Valens. However, rock and roll, while it was even being met with controversy in the United States, was still thriving thanks to the King, Elvis Presley, the fun California sound of the Beach Boys, and the emergence of Motown Records. EMI's American subsidiary Capitol Records hindered the Beatles' releases in the United States for more than a year, initially declining to issue their music, including their first 3 singles. Epstein arranged for a $40,000 U.S. marketing campaign. America's chart success began after disc jockey Carol James of the AM radio station WWWDC played their single I Want to Hold Your Hand in mid-December of 1963. This caused an increase in demand, leading Capitol Records to rush release I Want to Hold Your Hand later that month. Capitol's debut album, Meet the Beatles, would officially hit American record stores across the country, and the single She Loves You would soar to the top of the U.S. charts. It was time. The Beatles were ready to make their first appearance on American soil, and if they were to do it right, there was only one man across the pond that would place them into the history books.
I'm in love with you. It's easy 'cause I know